Rachel had always found solace in hiking. After months of grueling work in the city, she decided to take a solo trip to California's Big Pine Creek Trail. Known for its breathtaking lakes and rugged mountain views, it seemed like the perfect getaway. The trail was challenging but rewarding, and Rachel was confident in her skills. With a map, a backpack of essentials, and her sturdy hiking boots, she set off early one crisp morning. The first part of the hike was everything she hoped for. Towering pines lined the path, their scent mixing with the cool mountain air. Birds sang, and the distant sound of rushing water added to the serenity. Rachel felt at peace, enjoying the solitude and the rhythm of her footsteps. By midday, she reached the first of the 7 glacial lakes. The turquoise water shimmered under the sun, and she paused to snap a few photos. A couple of other hikers passed by, but as she ventured further along the trail, the encounters became less frequent. She welcomed the quiet. Around mid-afternoon, Rachel noticed something odd. She had the distinct feeling she was being watched. Stopping to catch her breath, she scanned the dense forest around her. The trees stood still, their branches motionless in the lack of wind. There was no sign of wildlife, not even a squirrel or bird. "It's just your imagination," she muttered to herself, shaking off the unease. Still, she couldn't shake the sensation, so she quickened her pace. As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, Rachel decided to set up camp near the third lake. She found a flat spot not far from the water and pitched her tent. The evening air grew colder, and she started a small fire to cook her dinner. The crackling flames provided a comforting light, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Then came the sound, a faint crunch of footsteps on the trail behind her. Rachel froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing into the stillness. No response. Gripping her flashlight, she stood and scanned the area. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating only the trees and rocks. No one was there. Her rational mind told her it was likely another hiker passing through, but something about the silence felt off. Most hikers would have greeted her or made some noise. Rachel decided to retreat to her tent, zipping it tightly. She clutched her bear spray for reassurance and lay down, listening intently. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No insects, no rustling leaves, nothing but the occasional drip of water from the lake. Just as she began to drift off, a low, guttural sound broke the silence. It wasn't an animal she recognized. It was deeper, almost human, but distorted. Rachel's heart raced as the sound grew closer. She fumbled for her flashlight and unzipped the tent slightly to peer outside. The fire had died down to embers, casting faint red light over the campsite. Beyond it, in the shadows, she saw movement. A tall figure stood at the edge of the trees, its shape obscured by the darkness. It didn't move toward her, but it didn't retreat either. It just stood there, watching. "Who's there?" Rachel shouted, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head as if curious, then slowly stepped back into the forest until it disappeared. Rachel didn't sleep that night. She kept her flashlight on and gripped her bear spray tightly. At the first light of dawn, she packed her belongings and decided to cut her trip short. Hiking alone suddenly didn't seem like a good idea. As she made her way back down the trail, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. Every now and then, she'd hear the crunch of footsteps behind her, but whenever she turned, no one was there. Her pace quickened, fear driving her forward. Near the trailhead, she encountered a park ranger. Relief washed over her as she approached him. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the ranger said, noting her pale face and trembling hands. Rachel quickly recounted her experience. The ranger listened intently, his expression growing serious. "You're not the first to report something like this," he said grimly. "Over the years, we've had hikers talk about strange sightings and noises on this trail. Some say it's the spirit of a man who got lost here decades ago. He never made it out, and his body was never found." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. She thanked the ranger and hurried to her car, vowing never to hike alone again. As she drove away, she glanced in her rearview mirror. For a split second, she thought she saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching her leave. But when she blinked, it was gone. Rachel didn't look back again. Jason had always been drawn to the towering redwoods of Northern California. After a recent breakup, he decided to clear his mind with a solo hike through the famed Redwood National Park. The idea of being surrounded by nature's giants was both comforting and invigorating. He arrived early in the morning, parking his car at a small, secluded trailhead. A light fog hung in the air, weaving through the massive trees like ghostly tendrils. Jason took a deep breath, shouldered his backpack, and started his journey. The trail was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. The redwoods stood like ancient sentinels, their sheer size and age filling him with awe. As he walked, Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of reverence for the forest. It was as though he had entered another world, one untouched by time. Several miles into the hike, Jason noticed something strange. The sounds of the forest seemed to fade. The birds' calls stopped, and the rustling of leaves ceased. Even the breeze, which had been gently swaying the treetops, seemed to vanish. He paused, listening intently, but the silence was almost oppressive. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing faintly. There was no response. Shrugging off the unease, he continued walking. But as he rounded a bend in the trail, he spotted something that made him stop in his tracks. In the middle of the path lay a wooden figurine, intricately carved and no larger than his hand. It resembled a humanoid figure, its arms outstretched and its face twisted in what looked like anguish. Jason picked it up, examining the craftsmanship. It was beautiful, yet unsettling. Who would leave this here? He placed it back on the ground and moved on, but the unease lingered. A few minutes later, he spotted another figurine, this one propped against the base of a tree. It was similar to the first, but slightly larger, and its face appeared to be screaming. Jason's heart began to race. It felt as though he was being led somewhere, but he couldn't see who or what was guiding him. He considered turning back, but decided against it. He was a rational man, and he refused to let fear ruin his hike. As he continued, the figurines became more frequent. Each one was larger and more detailed than the last. Some were posed as if reaching for something, while others looked like they were fleeing. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that they were trying to tell a story, but he couldn't decipher it. The trail eventually led him to a small clearing. In the center stood a massive redwood with a hollowed-out base. Inside the hollow, Jason saw the largest figurine yet. It stood nearly 2 feet tall and was carved with such precision that it almost looked alive. Its eyes seemed to follow him, and its expression was one of pure terror. Jason's breath caught as he heard a faint whisper. It was so soft he couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakable. He spun around, searching for the source, but he was alone. The whisper came again, louder this time, and it seemed to emanate from the hollow tree. "Leave," the voice said, low and guttural. Jason didn't need to be told twice. He turned and sprinted back down the trail, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. The forest seemed darker now, and the towering trees that had once filled him with awe now felt menacing. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see something chasing him, but the trail remained empty. As he neared the trailhead, he slowed, his lungs burning from the exertion. Relief washed over him as he saw his car through the thinning trees. But as he approached, he stopped dead in his tracks. Sitting on the hood of his car was another figurine. It was the same size as the one in the hollow tree, and its face was twisted in that same expression of terror. Jason's hands trembled as he picked it up. Beneath it was a small piece of paper, folded neatly. He unfolded the note, his heart pounding. Scrawled in shaky handwriting were the words, "You've been marked." Jason dropped the figurine and the note, jumped into his car, and sped away. He didn't stop until he was miles from the trailhead. For weeks after, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, and he often heard faint whispers when he was alone. The figurines haunted his dreams, their twisted faces etched into his mind. He never returned to the redwoods. To this day, Jason wonders what he encountered on that trail and what it truly meant to be marked. Sophia had heard the tales of Lost Lake from her friends, stories of eerie echoes and strange occurrences that locals swore were true, but she dismissed them as urban legends. An avid hiker and photographer, she decided to visit the area to capture its rumored beauty and see if there was any truth to the whispers. Lost Lake was nestled deep within a secluded section of Northern California's wilderness, accessible only by a narrow, overgrown trail. Sophia arrived early, the rising sun casting a golden glow on the dense forest. She parked her car at a small gravel lot and began the trek, her camera swinging gently from her neck. The trail was rugged, winding through dense foliage and past towering pines. As she walked, the air grew cooler, and an unnatural stillness settled over the forest. The usual sounds of birds and insects were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. Sophia brushed off the unease, chalking it up to the remoteness of the location. After an hour of hiking, she reached Lost Lake. The water was perfectly still, its glassy surface reflecting the surrounding trees like a mirror. The beauty of the scene took her breath away. She set up her camera and began snapping photos, capturing the tranquil beauty of the lake and its surroundings. But as she moved along the shore, Sophia began to notice something odd. The reflections in the water didn't always match the scene before her. In one photo, she saw a figure standing among the trees across the lake. It was faint, almost translucent, but unmistakably human. She glanced up, scanning the tree line, but saw no one. Sophia dismissed it as a trick of the light or a flaw in her lens. She continued taking photos, but the unease grew. Shadows seemed to shift in her peripheral vision, and faint whispers reached her ears, carried on the still air. When she turned to look, the shadows were gone, and the whispers fell silent. As the day wore on, the feeling of being watched intensified. She decided to explore further, hoping to shake the unease. She followed a narrow path that circled the lake, her footsteps crunching softly on the forest floor. Halfway around, she stumbled upon a small, weathered cabin hidden among the trees. The cabin looked abandoned, its windows shattered, and its door hanging askew. Curious, Sophia approached cautiously. The wooden steps creaked under her weight as she stepped onto the porch. She pushed the door open, revealing a single room filled with dust and cobwebs. Inside, she found a table with old photographs scattered across its surface. The photos were faded, but she could make out the images of a family. A man, a woman, and 2 children. They stood by the lake, smiling at the camera. Sophia felt a pang of sadness as she wondered what had become of them. Among the photos was a journal, its leather cover cracked with age. She opened it carefully, reading the faded handwriting. The entries spoke of strange happenings at the lake, unexplained noises, sightings of figures in the woods, and the disappearance of animals. The final entry was chilling. The whispers are louder now. They call to us, begging us to join them. We cannot stay here any longer. Tomorrow we leave and pray we are not too late. A sudden noise outside made Sophia jump. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. She froze, her heart pounding. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. She held her breath, straining to listen, but the silence returned. Summoning her courage, she stepped outside, her camera clutched tightly in her hands. The forest was empty, but as she looked toward the lake, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Standing on the shore was the same figure she had seen in the reflection. It was a man, his features indistinct, as though he were made of smoke. He raised an arm, pointing directly at her. Sophia backed away, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure began to move, gliding toward her without making a sound. She turned and ran, not daring to look back. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling her ears with words she couldn't understand. She reached the trailhead and jumped into her car, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and she sped away, her hands trembling on the wheel. Only when she was miles away did she dare to glance in the rearview mirror. The figure stood at the edge of the forest, watching her go. Sophia never developed the photos she took at Lost Lake. The camera remained in her closet, untouched, a reminder of the day she felt the otherworldly presence of something she couldn't explain. Though she tried to forget, the whispers haunted her dreams, a chilling echo of her encounter at Lost Lake. Jake had always been drawn to the allure of solitude. A seasoned hiker, he relished the opportunity to disconnect from the chaos of modern life and immerse himself in nature. When he heard about a remote trail near Mount Shasta in Northern California, he couldn't resist. The locals called it the Solitary Trail, an unmarked path known for its stunning views and eerie silence. Despite the warnings about the trail, stories of hikers who vanished without a trace or returned with fractured memories, Jake dismissed them as mere folklore. Armed with a sturdy backpack, a map, and his camera, he set out early one crisp autumn morning. The trailhead was hidden, marked only by a faint break in the trees. As Jake began his journey, he was struck by the beauty of the forest. The towering pines formed a canopy overhead, their needles muffling his footsteps. Rays of sunlight pierced the foliage, casting dappled patterns on the ground. Hours passed, and Jake's spirits soared. The trail led him to a series of breathtaking vistas, each more stunning than the last. He paused frequently to capture the scenery, his camera clicking away. But as he ventured deeper into the woods, an unsettling sensation crept over him. The air grew heavy, and the vibrant forest seemed to lose its color, replaced by a muted, shadowy palette. Around midday, Jake reached a clearing with a small, crystal-clear pond at its center. The still water mirrored the surrounding trees perfectly, creating an almost hypnotic effect. He crouched by the pond, refilling his water bottle, when he noticed something peculiar. The reflection of the forest in the water didn't match the trees around him. In the reflection, he saw movement, a figure darting between the trees. Jake spun around, but the forest behind him was empty. His pulse quickened, but he told himself it was a trick of the light. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Continuing along the trail, Jake's unease grew. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees standing unnaturally close together. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the trail, he realized he hadn't seen any wildlife for hours. He reached a fork in the trail and consulted his map, but the path wasn't marked. Frustrated, he chose the left fork, reasoning that it seemed to follow the general direction back to the trailhead. As he walked, the whispers began. Faint and distant at first, they seemed to emanate from the forest itself. Jake stopped, straining to listen, but the whispers ceased. He pressed on, his heart pounding. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct, though he couldn't make out the words. It was as if the forest was alive, speaking a language he couldn't understand. Suddenly, the trail ended abruptly at a cliff's edge. Below, a dense fog obscured the forest floor. Jake turned to retrace his steps, but the trail behind him was gone. In its place was a wall of trees, their gnarled branches intertwined like skeletal fingers. Panic set in as he realized he was trapped. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Jake clutched his camera, snapping photos wildly, as if documenting his plight might provide some kind of solace. A figure emerged from the fog below, ascending the cliff with unnatural speed. It was humanoid, but distorted, its limbs too long and its movements jerky. Jake stumbled backward, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure stopped at the cliff's edge, its face shrouded in shadow. "Leave," it hissed, the word cutting through the whispers like a blade. Jake turned and ran, crashing through the dense underbrush. Branches clawed at his face and arms, but he didn't stop. The whispers followed him, rising to a deafening roar. He burst into another clearing and froze. The pond was before him again, its surface now dark and churning. The reflection in the water showed multiple figures standing at the edge of the clearing, their hollow eyes fixed on him. Desperation took hold as Jake dove into the forest, tearing through the trees in a blind panic. He didn't stop until he broke through the tree line and stumbled onto a dirt road. Collapsing to his knees, he looked back but saw nothing but the darkening forest. A passing car stopped, and the driver helped Jake to his feet. He mumbled something about being lost, too shaken to explain further. The driver dropped him off at the nearest town, where he locked himself in a motel room and reviewed the photos on his camera. The images were distorted, filled with shadowy figures and twisted trees that didn't match the forest he had seen. In the final photo, taken just before he fled, the humanoid figure stood inches from the lens, its hollow eyes staring directly into the camera. Jake never hiked again. The camera sat untouched on a shelf, a haunting reminder of the solitary trail. Though he tried to move on, he could still hear the whispers in his dreams, calling him back to the forest that wouldn't let him go.